All right, now we're going to get started on Lesson 1, installing Microsoft SQL or SQL Server. Now there's quite a few steps that we need to think about before we actually do the install of SQL. First off, we need a good plan. Always have to have a good plan. Planning is super key when you do anything with anything in IT, especially the Microsoft products, it seems like, for Active Directory, SQL Server, Exchange, anything like that that you're going to install, we need to make sure we have a good plan in place. So we're going to have a good plan in place and examine the environment that we have. What infrastructure is already in place? What resources do we have available to us? What budget do we have to maintain our SQL Server, to install our SQL Server? What edition? How many licensing? What type of hardware we're going to use? And so on and so forth. There's all kind of planning steps that we have to have in place before we can actually do the install. Now there are a few hardware requirements that we have for SQL Server. Just like any other server system that we're going to install, it's usually the first thing we need to think about is what server system do we need to have in place so we can put this software on there. Now there's different editions of SQL Server, which we're going to talk about here a little bit later, but I listed the requirements for the most popular one, I would guess, like the standard and the enterprise editions, either 32-bit or 64-bit, it doesn't really matter. But you need something at least 2 gigahertz or faster, at least 4 gigs of RAM. Well, it said, actually Microsoft says at least 1 to 2 gigs of RAM. Recommended is 4. I would recommend even more, depending on the load, how much input, output you're going to have, how much use, I guess is what I'm trying to say, you're going to try to get out of this SQL Server. I've never installed a SQL Server with less than 8 gigs of RAM, so make sure you have at least 8. Now we know if we have a 32-bit, we can't obviously use 8 because it won't be able to allocate for that RAM. So that would obviously be a 64-bit install, but at least 8 gigs of RAM, if not more. The more the merrier. You need a 1 gig hard drive. That is for the install, just the install. And then Server 03 with Service Pack 2 or higher. We're going to need that operating system to put on top because SQL Server is not an operating system in itself. We have to actually put that on top inside there and have something in place. So it is an application that we do install. Now we do have those different editions that I mentioned. We have like a compact edition, which would be for smart devices or tablets. It's a very compact edition of SQL. It does a very few things. It's not the full-blown. This is not what you want in your production environment per se. Then we have the Express Edition, or the Express Edition with some advanced services or advanced features that you can have. This is very popular when you're trying to learn SQL Server. It is Express. It's not meant for a production environment per se. You can use it for low-end web development, low-end ins and outs, but you have to be careful because it only has a 4 gig limit to its database. It only supports 1 CPU and only supports 1 gig of RAM. So that's why it's very good to use in like on your laptop if you want to play around with SQL Server. As you're learning 08 here, this is free, so you can go download that, put this on your laptop or your desktop to learn and step through some of these things we're going to be talking about to actually get more familiar and do your own little labs at home. SQL Server Express Edition is a very good tool to use for yourself to learn this product. And then we have the Web Edition, which that's to support web applications. Normally that's on the back end of a web server. There's no license limits here because, well, we can't dictate how many people are actually going to be connected to us from the World Wide Web or from the internet. We could have 10, we could have 100, we could have tens of thousands of people, which would be ridiculous to buy licensing for 10,000 people. So there's no license limit on this. It does have a 4 CPU limit, but there's no max database limit as well. So you know, like I just said, Express has a 4 gig limit. This one has no database limit, so it could be as large as it needs to get. And again, this is to support those web users, or those web applications, I should say. Then we have a Workgroup Edition, which is a little bit different than the domain type editions, but that supports 2 CPUs, 3 gigs of RAM, and no max database limit for the Workgroup Edition. Then we get to the big boys, the Standard Edition, which supports up to 4 CPUs, and it does not have a RAM max limit as well. There's no database limit for standard either. And then we have the enterprise or the developer or the evaluation edition, which they could all be the same. Developer edition is, well, as for developers, we're not going to put this in a production environment per se. And then the evaluation edition, obviously that's just for evaluation. That is a 180-day limit. You know, usually that's going to kick off at 180 days, so we wouldn't want to use that for production either. One other thing, the development edition only supports one end user. Now the enterprise edition, or all of them I should say, but the enterprise edition is the one that you want to put in your production. But all of these have no max CPU, so we can have as many those CPUs, those central processing units, as we need. As much RAM as we need, as we can throw in that. And this is where especially, you know, we have to have at least 4 as Microsoft recommends. This is where I would push the limit to 16, 32, 64, 96, depending on what type of enterprise you have and what type of services you're going to run for this SQL Server. And also there's no database size limit for this as well. So enterprise is for your enterprise level type services where you're going to run full-fledged applications for your employees, for your customers, whoever you're supporting on the back end here. This enterprise system is the way to go. It's probably the most expensive one, but you're going to get the most bang for your buck. And then finally, we have a runtime edition, which is kind of like, well, I should just say it's embedded into software. You might have a software solution that you have and you need some type of database integration in there. So instead of having a full-fledged database server on the back end, you just take a small SQL server and you stick it in there. So it's called the runtime edition, which we embed that inside of your software solution that you may already have in place, or the software application that a developer has developed for something else. Now earlier I talked about the workgroup edition, and I said it's a little different from the domains. We need to talk about domains and workgroups a little bit. You may already know, but if not, we can put a SQL Server in a domain setting, or we can put a SQL Server in a workgroup setting. Obviously it's going to depend on your organization, your infrastructure, if you already have a domain in place, or if you're in a workgroup type setting. If you're in a large enterprise, more than likely you're in a domain type setting. And we know that domain is that security boundary with the tree type structure. Like we would have something.com and we could have a subdomain under that and a subdomain under that, which forms that tree for our Active Directory or for our directory services. Now, and all that is included inside of a forest. So we can have multiple domains inside our big forest, which is really the security boundary if you want to look at it. But that gives a common schema for all the domains inside of our forest. We can put that SQL Server in there to run inside of our domain. A couple caveats to that though is we're going to have a domain account. We need to make sure it's in Active Directory, things like that. So we can embed the SQL Server inside of our domain. Now, let's say we don't have Active Directory. You have a small business. You only have a handful of computers. You're working at your home. A lot of people don't have a domain at home. You can put your SQL Server in a workgroup setting. So everybody's still in a work group. You can still share, do simple shares inside of your work group. But now, instead of a domain type setting, we're going to talk about local accounts for that SQL Server. So we have workgroup settings, which everybody's peer-to-peer networking, everybody's equal, and then the domain setting where we have a domain controller or a directory services that kind of dictate what everybody can do. It has all that authorization and authentication on one server that controls what everybody does. So a little difference between domain and workgroup. Now something else we need to talk about is choosing the default instances or named instances. Virtualization has been around for a long time. We know we can take one physical machine and put virtual machines on top. Named instances is kind of like that for SQL Server. We can run multiple SQL servers on one machine. So we don't have to have a dedicated machine just for that dedicated server. Maybe we have a piece of hardware that's got 128 gigs of RAM, 4 quad-core processors, and it's just built to the max. Well, if we have a database solution that we need and it doesn't require all that hardware, we can actually put multiple SQL servers on there, and this SQL server takes care of this application or takes care of this department. This SQL server can take care of this department or this application or this domain. So we can use the one physical server but have different SQL servers on there. So that would be named instances because they're going to have different names. So if we want to run different ones, we can utilize that one piece of hardware and set up named instances where this name goes this way, this name will go this way. Now, if we don't do that, it will the setup is actually going to default to the default instance. I shouldn't bad choice of words there, but it's going to, when we do the install, we will use default instances, which will say that's one instance for that SQL server, and that's what we will use to call back or tie back to that SQL server. Usually that's the MS-SQL server that you'll see, the named instance that you'll see up in the top when we go through the installation. Any subsequent installations on that same machine can be given installation names up to 16 characters. So those named instances, they can have 16 characters to differentiate between the different installs that we have on that hardware machine. So as default instances, named instances. Now when we go through the install, or when you go through the install, you're going to have to decide on named instances or default instance. I'd recommend default first. Then you're going to be prompted for some service accounts. What that service account does, it gives access to the machine and the network with privileges to get its work done. Windows has services accounts on just about everything it does. We know there's processes running in the background on our servers, on our client machines all the time, but it's not always our account that we logged in with. It doesn't matter if it's local or domain that's running those processes in the background. It's some type of service account or computer account that's running those processes that allow it to talk to the computer, that allow it to talk to the network, to get things done in the background without using, let's say, your domain account, which may have administrative rights on your computer, and now we have a low-level process running with a domain, with administrative access to your system. We don't want that. So they have service accounts that are low accounts. They don't have very many permissions or privileges. So we use those low-level accounts to run those services in the background.